DOT, better known as damage over time, is a playstyle in which the main source of damage dealt to the enemy is consistently dealt every time the enemy takes their turn. This playstyle takes advantage of enemies not only have fast speeds, but also characters and mechanics that manipulate turn orders. Honkai Star Rail turned one of the most boring playstyles on paper to one of the best. Definitely a let 'em cook situation if I've ever seen one. There would be a few characters at the launch of Honkai Star Rail that applied dot effects alongside their personal damage. It's often forgotten that characters apply their skill multipliers and then the additional dot effect for more damage. The only characters that had this in their kits were Serval and Hook, one being given to the player for free and the other being obtained through the gacha. Himiko did have a dot added to her kit but was only available after a certain ascension. In the early game, the dot could in theory do more damage than your basic attack, elemental skill, and ultimate. Not only did you not have access to much crit stats, but also your talent levels were low by default. The last thing worth mentioning is that each element that could use dot would deal damage differently. Fire had a lot of break damage but less damage with the personal dot, Wind Shear had great personal damage and a scaling dot that could stack up to 5, and Physical had a dot that would deal a percentage of the enemy's max hit points. In the early game, to mid-game, the dot damage would fall off harshly, but the break damage of the target's toughness is where most of the character's damage would come from. This break damage on those enemies was scaled with Break Effect, which was a stat that would be very hard for the player to come across. However, Break Effect deserves its own video, so we'll end the discussion here. In patch 1.1, following the release of Silverwolf, we learned two very important things about damage over time. With a character like Silverwolf, being able to essentially decrease the enemy's defense and the enemy's resistance does much more damage if the enemy's defense is lower, because it doesn't ignore defense. Pela as well. If you decrease the enemy's defense with Pela, you will also increase the dot damage as well. The upcoming patch would feature the release of Kafka, whom in the second half of 1.2 would become known as the Pillar of Damage Over Time playstyle. Being the godfather of dots, Kafka could not only place her own dots into the enemy in AoE, but she could also proc any dot on the enemy at the instance of her using her elemental skill or ultimate. She essentially took the playstyle and sped it up. Enemies would die much more quicker and take what would be a triple dot proc depending on the circumstances, sometimes even more following the release of a particular character. Since we learned that damage over time have its own damage massively increased with Silverwolf, there would be a quick short-term meta shift in Honkai Star Rail. Kafka hypercarry teams with Ting Yun and Silverwolf would ensure two things. Your ultimate would be consistently available, and your damage over time would be as close to 2 damage as possible. Between Silverwolf's defense shred and resistance decrease, the lightning weakness being given to the enemy was a bonus. Their Kafka's personal damage would be heavily increased, and in combination with the Genius of Early Star's relic set, you'd ignore more of that enemy's defense. Now, while in hypercarry teams, Kafka lost her identity as the pillar of dot teams because her team was pretty similar to that of Jing's hypercarry. This time period will let us know what would be necessary for Kafka's dream team. A character that could decrease the enemy's defenses with their own personal damage, and a character that could provide various buffs for the team, whether that was attack, damage boost, break effect, or energy. Each of these aforementioned buffs would greatly increase the performances of the whole dot team. Kafka and Sampo would be the true damage over time team that performed extremely well when the enemies had wind and lightning weakness. Asta was a Harmony character mostly used because her attack and speed boost would increase your dot's damage and your proc of the dots with Kafka before that enemy would take their turn. But this would be the point in time where Kafka teams also became a little wonky. Let me explain. Depending on the elemental weaknesses of the enemy would result in the elemental typing you would bring to the fight with Kafka teams. While Sampo was the most versatile character to use, he wasn't always the best option. If the enemies had fire weakness, you could use Himiko alongside Kafka because they were both strong in AoE. Asta was also a buffer who gave further damage boost to fire characters, but was a best in slot support for Kafka nonetheless. Hook could also be used, but at this point, Pitch Dark Hook the Great would see less and less play as more enemies would be on the field and more players picked up Himiko. Serval could work decently alongside Kafka, but ultimately their previous synergy was gutted, quote unquote, before the arrival of Kafka, or rather never made it to live servers. You could use Silverwolf in 1 to 2 target fights, and with physical weakness enemies, we would receive our first character for those ideal scenarios on the same banner. Luca was a dot-eccentric character that not only had a ton of personal damage, but also of the physical element. Whenever there were 1 to 2 enemies on the field that were weak to physical, he would find himself always being paired alongside Kafka. And considering this was around the same time of Hoyoverse promoting both characters, you know there was always favorite matchups. during the same time period would also spark some tension from a previously released lightning damage dealer whose community had a lot to say. Tier list is always something to take with a grain of salt. You can't please everyone essentially. Take it from someone who absolutely adores Mono Quantum. I learned the art of not caring. As for the rest of the crowd, they absolutely cared. Jing would appear to be a worse character than Kafka, but there is a few things you must understand. Kafka received more teammates than would Jing at this time period, and the flavor of the month was Kafka. Despite the enemies at the time having lightning weakness, it was stated that Jing teams would perform worse than Kafka teams, but it seems to me that it ultimately depended on the investment of the character. This will be much like discussed in the recent video where Kafka and Jing would go toe to toe each patch, ultimately resulting in the characters having around similar performances in the end game. However, I can certainly say this would be where DOT would remain on hiatus as the Destruction duo did their damage. I mean, after all, every playstyle was affected by the simultaneously release of these characters. Oh, and while every other character got essentially buffed with the release of Fu Xuan, damage over time characters ideally wanted 0 crit stats, which meant those provided by Fu Xuan would make her less appealing in those teams, but she could work by all means. This also meant Jing's hyper carry team was to become better than Kafka's best damage over time and hyper carry team because he synergized better with the new support. This was the sad fate of damage over time characters, while really only being rumors. Topaz releasing in 1.4 after Jing Lu supposedly had a DOT application in her kit at some point. Considering how Kafka and Topaz had synergy with one another via the follow-up attack every turn from a mere Topaz basic, I found this conspiracy to be rather interesting enough to mention in this video. Green Eye Fen would be a featured 4-star in Topaz's banner and honestly just ending up replacing Himiko and Kafka teams, as she not only had better personal damage, easier accessibility, but also damage buffing capabilities for the damage over time team. It wouldn't be until patch 1.5 and after where Kafka and DOT would have their redemption era. This would be arguably the best set of patches that any character has received in all Honkai Star Rail, because in each of these patches will lie a best in slot support for Kafka and her teams. I guess you can call this the bleed era, because your resources as a Kafka main are bled dry, and bleed is a form of DOT. The first half of 1.5 would contain a relic set that for DOT characters would raise their damage ceiling without needing Silverwolf to do so. The Prisoner and Deep Confinement relic set not only increased the attack of every character equipped in this set, but also allowed their DOT effects to ignore a percentage of the enemy's defenses depending on the amount of dots present on the enemy. Additionally, new planar sets would drop in the same patch, and one of those being the Glamoff, which gave an attack increase and up to 18% damage increase depending on the amount of speed present on the character equipped in this planar set. As we discussed in the earlier part of the video, every DOT character wants speed and attack, so they were to ultimately see a massive damage increase going into this patch. And yes, Jing also, this was his domain as well. In the second half of 1.5 would be a defensive option that not only gave tons of cleansing and healing, but also attack and percent energy gain on the ultimate, which made her a mainstay in both hyper carry and DOT teams especially. Huo was and is still, to this day, a best in slot teammate for Kafka DOT teams. I personally love this character. He has a nice design that was meta defining but not meta creeping. So not only could Kafka teams do more damage, but now had more accessibility to their ultimates more often, making zero cycling much more effective. I kid you not, that's all it took to impress the community at the time. Jing teams also saw a nice boost following the release of Huo. I meant when I said when these two lightning damage dealers were head to head. After this hectic change of pace, things would only continue to become more shocking for Kafka and DOT teams, because if you were a casual Kafka main, your resources were thinning around this point. Ruan Mei would release in the first half of 1.6 right after the end of Huo's banner, which meant very little time to save. Ruan Mei would be the first true universal buffer, but ultimately best in slot for damage over time teams because of her mechanics and many buffs she would give to everyone on the field. Huge damage boost, break effect efficiency, skill points, resistance, penetration, speed, personal damage, and additional delay on the enemy's turn that were weakness broken, giving Kafka the chance to quadruple proc dots on a given enemy if the circumstances aligned. Ruan Mei will be the biggest buffer to DOT teams and still is so to this day. I'll personally consider this the peak of damage over time teams. I know what you might be thinking, I'm completely wrong here, but let me explain. Ruan Mei would gain even more value as a character in 2.0 from not only the release of a broken best in slot ally for Kafka teams, but also the release of a best in slot relic set that gave further beneficial stats to the DOT team that they would benefit from, but had no way of being included in their build paths. After this double set of harsh patches would lie another harsh patch for Kafka mains, but also be the peak of DOT teams and lead us to where we are today. The first half of 2.0 would be the release of Black Swan. And the relics that we mentioned just a second ago, the Watchmaker Master of Dream Machinations relic set, or Watchmaker for short, would give a break effect boost to the wearer and team-wide break effect increase after the usage of an ultimate on an ally from the one equipping this relic set. Ruan Mei gets her ultimate reliably and scales off break effect, increasing her personal damage and buffs for the team. It would also meant giving a further increase of break effect, which is a rare stat for DOT characters, would increase their damage away clear potential by a nice margin. The 5-star of this patch, Black Swan, also appreciated break effect given from Ruan Mei. Black Swan was and is a whole different level compared to the previous releases of 5-star characters pre 2.0. She gave defense down on AoE, better on the skill point economy, and crazy scaling personal damage. She's Sampo and Pela with just way more damage, which results in an overloaded character. Alongside Kafka, Ruan Mei, and Huo, these two would absolutely break the damage ceiling and create the most satisfying combat loop in all of Honkai Star Rail. Enemies would die and new ones would spawn after with dots from Black Swan, which meant that this team had the most consistent damage of any team yet. At this point in time, I couldn't fathom how the damage ceiling could be raised further for DOT teams, but Black Swan had proved one thing: 2 Kafkas is better than 1. Since damage over time has had a distinct and clear playstyle, this team ultimately won't see a mass decrease in usage going forward, unless there was some enemies resistant to debuffs. But considering the many enemies weak to both wind and lightning these days, this will be the golden era for damage over time. Oh, and one important thing worth noting is that some believe we are slated for a more suited defensive option for DOT teams. I personally don't see eye to eye with this sentiment, because Huo is perfect for the DOT team. However, I do understand a defensive option with more personal damage that could benefit from the buffs provided by Ruan Mei could actually work. I think at this point, this team would become kill or be killed, because there's absolutely no way Hoyoverse could make a defensive option that heals, cleanses, provides personal damage with a damage over time, and possibly buff the other damage dealers as well. Gallagher did release in 2.1 as a feature 4-star on Acheron's banner, so it's very possible that Hoyoverse could actually pull this off. He's great in Kafka DOT teams so far. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day.